Alright, so today we're going to talk about adjusting the trigger on a SIG 550 series rifle. If you look at reviews online, you'll hear people say, this gun has a trigger that's single stage or two stage or up to three stage. And unless you've handled this rifle and tried the trigger yourself, it's really hard to know for yourself whether or not this is actually a single stage, two stage, or three stage trigger. And the funny thing is, they could all be true because this trigger is actually highly adjustable and somewhat unique in the black rifle world. So we're going to go over what a single stage, two stage, and the quote-unquote three-stage trigger is, and then we're going to go into how to modify or how to adjust this trigger. So first of all, what does it look like out of the box? So when I first got my rifle, this is what the trigger was set to. So if you can see here, there's a bit of take up, and about halfway through, it sort of changes in the amount of pressure that you need to actually pull the trigger. So just right about here, there's a little bit more resistance. And then you get to even more resistance once you hit this plunger at the back. So this is what people call the three-stage trigger. So first stage, second stage, and then the third stage, which is a very spongy sort of creep, and then it breaks. And there's actually no sort of end stop to this trigger unless you pull all the way to the end, which is very hard. The trigger won't stop at a set point. You'll sort of get this spongy springiness to it. And if you've never handled this rifle, if you've only seen photos or videos of it, you might get confused about this plunger because it kind of looks like an end stop or over travel stop. So what I thought it was before I got this rifle was you pull through the first stage, and then as soon as the trigger breaks, it'll stop on this plunger. But that's not the case. This plunger actually adds another stage to the trigger. So that's the SIG 550 trigger. But if we compare that trigger to this trigger, which is a Colt Canada SA-15-7, just an AR-15. So this has a single stage trigger. So as I pull the trigger, I'm giving it constant force, and it just breaks. There's no take up. So you don't have that first stage where you can move the trigger with very little force. It's you add pressure and then it breaks. A two-stage trigger, like on the SIG P229, you get this take up, or the first stage, where it's very light pressure, and then you hit a wall. And the wall is where you hit significantly more resistance, and as you pull through it, it breaks. So now that you know how the trigger is set to from the factory, we'll go into how the trigger feels when you've modified it. So in order to adjust the trigger, you need to move this plunger back and forth, and that completely changes the feel of the trigger. So you've seen the first, the three-stage quote-unquote trigger as it came from the factory. I've moved the plunger all the way to the rear so that the trigger will not contact it before it breaks. And we'll see how that changes things. So you still sort of have a little bit of change in the amount of pressure, just about here. It's hardly noticeable though, and you keep on pulling, and it breaks. So as you can see, when you pull through this trigger, there's actually no wall. There's no spot where you're like, this is about to break if I pull any further. You just sort of pull right through it. And that's what people call the single stage, quote unquote, trigger. So if you compare this once again to the AR-15 single stage trigger. You can see that there's quite a bit of creep, what they call trigger creep. So if it was a good single stage trigger, you would just add pressure and it would break. But as it stands currently, if you pull it with constant pressure, it'll go back, and then it'll break. So when you hear the trigger of the 550 series described as a long, creepy single stage trigger, then that's generally how the trigger is configured for those people. Alright, so now that we've seen the quote-unquote 3-stage trigger, the single stage trigger, it's time to show you how to adjust this plunger and turn it into a 2-stage trigger. So first thing you need to do is separate the upper from the lower. Alright, so you're going to want to put the safety on, and what you need to do is take the pistol grip off. And this isn't, it's sort of the reverse of the AR-15. So instead of having to remove the screw from the inside of the pistol grip, you have to remove it from the inside of the receiver. So you need to take a 4mm hex wrench, start undoing this screw. It's held in by a nylon lock nut. So you just need to keep on turning until the pistol grip comes off. And the lock nut will actually fall into the pistol grip itself. You can recover that later by taking off the little cap at the bottom. So drop that bolt out. And here you'll see the plunger assembly. So the plunger itself is actually also held in by a little nylon lock nut. And this spring is what gives it the movement back and forth. So what you're going to want to do is back this plunger out up until the point where as you move the trigger back, just before it's about to break, it will contact this the face of the plunger. So in order to adjust the plunger, you need a 7mm wrench. I don't have one, so I just 3D printed one. It's easier if you actually fold the trigger guard out of the way. You attach your wrench. It's a little bit difficult. Would be a little easier if I had the proper tool, but I don't. There we go. So, and because the plunger is almost all the way to the rear, I need to loosen it. So I'll need to rotate it this way. Alright, so I also don't have the correct wrench for this lock nut. Looks like might be 5mm. So I'm just going to use needle nose pliers. Alright, so I'm just going to keep on backing. Backing the plunger out. Okay, hopefully that's far enough. So in order to test it, you'll have to dry fire the trigger. You generally don't want to do that with the upper receiver off, so you're going to have to temporarily put it back on, and you're going to want to mock up your pistol grip, so you're going to put that on temporarily. Try it again, so stage 1. That's pretty close actually. So you're going to want it so that just as soon as you get to the edge of the brake, you encounter the plunger and then you pull through. That's pretty close. Let's try that again. So the pistol grip isn't attached right now, so that's why it's a little bit more difficult to maneuver this around. So pull, and we've hit the plunger. Let's see how much more pressure we need. That's pretty good. Alright, I'm satisfied with that. So, if you need to go any further forward or back, again, you just adjust it slightly until you get to that point. On another note, I've actually 3D printed something, another part for this plunger, and it's basically an over travel stop, so that when you pull through, the plunger will actually stop and won't travel any further back, so you won't get that sponginess after the trigger breaks. So let's see if that works. Okay, not bad. Yeah, so as you can see, after the trigger broke, you basically had no movement to the rear. Nice. So once you've verified that you have the correct distance set on your plunger, you need to attach your pistol grip back to your receiver. So pull the two halves apart. You're going to need to pop this cap off. This little nylon lock nut, you need to make sure it's seated in the little hexagonal recess that keeps it from rotating. Hold that with your finger and stick your pistol grip back on. And then with your other hand, drop the bolt in place and tighten it with the 4mm hex wrench. Remember not to over tighten it because you'll screw up the nylon insert. Pop that cap back on. Put your receivers back together. And there you go. Nice two-stage trigger. So single stage, you get that take up all the way up to the wall right here. Sometimes you'll get a click if you bring it up to the wall and release it. If you're not comfortable with that, you can back the plunger out just a little bit further. That's just the, I believe it's the disconnector. So pull it through the first stage and just give it a tiny little bit more pressure and it'll break. The over travel stop will prevent it from going any further, and you have a nice, crisp two-stage trigger.